Star Wars only. I don't know what the fuck your problem is.
Bob Iger's new book talks about the negotiations that went into Disney buying the Star Wars franchise from its creator, George Lucas. And in this video, I'll tell you exactly how it happened and what led to the sale of Star Wars. After Disney bought Marvel in 2009, Bob Iger had thought of buying Lucasfilm from George, but was unsure how to approach him about the subject without offending him in any way. Lucas and Iger had a mutual friend in Steve Jobs, who bought the company Pixar from Lucas to later sell it to Disney. Steve Jobs told Bob Iger that they should visit George at his Skywalker Ranch to have a lunch and discuss the matter. Unfortunately, Steve became too ill to make the trip, but still the idea remained in Iger's mind. So he took advantage of an opportunity in May of 2011. George was visiting Walt Disney World for the reopening of the Star Tours ride after a year-long refurbishing. Iger invited George and his then-fiancée Melody to the Hollywood Brown Derby Diner for breakfast. And to the surprise of Lucas, it was a private meeting. But it was here that Bob Iger asked George if he would ever consider selling Lucasfilm. He said to Lucas, "I don't want to be fatalistic, George, and please stop me if you would rather not have this conversation, but I think it's worth putting this on the table. What happens down the road? You don't have any heirs who are going to run the company for you. They may control it, but they're not going to run it for you. Shouldn't you determine who protects and carries out your legacy?" George told Iger, "I'm not ready to sell, but you're right. And if I decide to, there isn't anyone else I want to sell to but you." George brought up Disney buying Pixar from Steve Jobs, saying to Iger, "You did that right. You took care of them. If I get around to it, you're the only call I'll make." Then George said something that struck an emotional chord with Iger. He told Bob, "When I die, the first line of my obituary is going to read, Star Wars creator George Lucas." After this, Bob Iger knew he wasn't buying a business from George Lucas. He was buying the man's legacy, so he decided to no longer press Lucas on the matter and let him be the first one to reach out if he truly was interested. In December of 2011, George called Bob and told him, "I'd like to have lunch to talk more about that thing we talked about in Orlando." The two met in Disney in Burbank, where George said he was ready to get serious about selling the franchise, and told Iger he wanted the Pixar deal, which was the first sign to Iger that the negotiations were not going to be easy. Because when Disney bought Pixar, they paid $7.4 billion for it. And Pixar had 6 films in development at the time of the purchase, with release dates lined up. Pixar also had directors and seasoned writers with a top-of-the-line production team. Lucasfilm only had one director, and that was George Lucas, with no films in development or production pipeline. And since Lucasfilm was not a publicly traded company, the finances of the company were completely unknown to Disney. So Disney had to guess a price range for the purchase based off the assets that Lucasfilm had. The analysis Disney took of Lucasfilm was in early 2012, so they planned on releasing a Star Wars film every other year in the first 6 years of owning the franchise, with the first film releasing in 2015, and the other two following in 2017 and 2019. Disney came to the conclusion that they needed each of these new films to reach $1 billion in the global box office to make the money back. But based off the informal analysis of Lucasfilm, Bob Iger knew the company was not worth $7.4 billion at the time. So he told Lucas, "There's no way this is a Pixar deal, George." He explained the logistics behind his reasoning. Lucas was surprised with this, but he asked Iger, "Well then what do we do now?" Iger knew that the company needed to see the finances of Lucasfilm to properly evaluate the best value for the purchase. They signed a confidentiality agreement, and Iger sent a small and secretive team from Disney to look into Lucasfilm's finances and revenue structure, and made sure that the Lucasfilm employees were unaware of this process. Bob Iger wanted Lucas to know that he wasn't going to lowball him on an offer, and truly wanted to be transparent. He told George, "I don't mess around when it comes to these things. I'm not going to come in low and negotiate towards the middle. I'm going to do it the way I did with Steve." The team at Disney then began working on coming up with the proper estimates for the Lucasfilm company. But internally, Iger knew there still was a problem on a proper creative vision. When buying Pixar, they had many projects in the works and people to helm them. Lucasfilm had nothing like that in 2012, and was basically a blank sheet for the Disney company with no creative vision for the future of Star Wars. Iger called George after the process and told him that he narrowed down the price range from $3.5 to $3.75 billion. But George refused to take anything less than the deal Marvel had when Disney bought them for $4 billion. So Iger offered $4.05 billion, and Lucas immediately agreed. Then negotiations got even more complicated. When discussing George's involvement creatively with Star Wars, the two sides had trouble coming to an agreement. Iger says that Lucas wanted to retain his creative control over Star Wars even after selling the company, still being in charge of Star Wars without being an employee of Disney. But Bob Iger knew he couldn't buy the Lucasfilm company, only to let Lucas decide what films to make and when to make them. Disney knew they needed to release the films as soon as possible to make their money back, and letting Lucas stay in charge brought the risk up. Iger explained to Lucas they could not spend that type of money and let him remain in charge. The pair debated the matter for months, Lucas saying that he couldn't just hand over his legacy, and Iger saying he couldn't buy it without controlling it. This led to the deal being called off twice. The first time Disney walked away from the deal. After renegotiating again, Lucas walked away. During this process, Lucas told Iger that he had completed outlines for his ideas on the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Disney bought the story treatments that Lucas sent, but made it clear in the purchase agreement that the Disney company did not have to adhere to the story that George wrote. But something changed that year that put a lot of pressure on Lucas, where he knew that he had to sell the company by the end of 2012. Due to a new government capital gains law, Lucas would have to take a $500 million hit on the sale of Lucasfilm if he sold the company after the year 2012. This is what saved the negotiations between the two and led to Lucas selling his company to cut cost. The matter of creative control was never settled, and Lucas reluctantly agreed to consult with Disney on Star Wars films at their request. In October of 2012, the deal was official, and George signed over Star Wars to Disney. Iger said that he noticed how emotional it was for Lucas selling the company. You could hear it in his voice and see it in his eyes. The man had sold his legacy, but not entirely on the terms that he wanted.